This is FRM Part 2, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on Basel III, Finalising Post-Crisis Reforms. This is the third chapter in a series of chapters in which we talked about regulation before the financial crisis of 2008, after the financial crisis of 2008, and then this chapter kind of continues along that theme, finalizing post-crisis reforms. The good news for you guys is this is a relatively short chapter, which means a relatively short slide deck, but I'm particularly excited about making this recording for the following reason. Look at these learning objectives. Now, we'll spend most of our time on this standardized approach. We'll talk about the business indicator and the internal loss multiplier. And some of you may have noticed that in the previous chapter, you may have thought I kind of glossed over those variables. But last chapter was more general. This chapter is more specific. So we're going to go ahead and jump into those details. And then look at the last part of that first learning objective. Calculate the operational risk capital requirement. Well, the fascinating thing about this chapter is that there is no example in it about calculating the operational risk capital. We're led right to the edge, but we didn't quite make that final calculation. But I do that for you in this slide deck. So that will address that specific learning objective. And then the last couple of slides, we'll go ahead and talk about general and specific criteria. And that should be a good series of slides for you because it's relatively common sense and probably something that you and I would come up with if we wanted to develop some of these criteria. So let's go ahead and start with the good old definition of operational risk. And you should be saying this to yourself. You should say, oh, Jim, we've had this definition before. Of course, let me go ahead and read it to you. Risk of loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people, systems, or from external events. And we've talked about fraud. We've talked about employee errors. We even had a fascinating chapter on criminal activity and then security breaches. And so I think this is important here. Excludes reputational risk as well as strategic risk. So the focus of the beginning of this chapter and is on that very first learning objective, the standardized approach. So it has it's based on three variables. The business indicator, and this is a financial statement-based proxy for operational risk, and I'll talk more of details there in just a second. And then the business indicator component is going to be that business indicator determined by some marginal coefficient. I use the notation, the Greek alpha there. So all we're doing is taking part A and multiplying it by some percentile that's given to us by the regulators. And then the internal loss multiplier is going to be, now prepare yourself for this. I'm not going to say that it's exactly like beta from our equity discussions, but it's very similar. So what we're going to do is scale based on, some kind of history. You'll see what I mean mathematically here in just a few minutes. All right, so I went ahead and repeated the top part of the slide, but let me show you how simple this equation is for operational risk capital. All we're going to do is take the business indicator component and we're going to multiply it by an internal loss multiplier. And that internal loss multiplier, and you'll see this mathematically, is going to be close to 1. Might be a little bit above, might be a little bit below. There we go. Does that sound a little bit like beta? Now, the business indicator component is really a simple calculation as well. Notice what I have in the formula there. Forget about the sigma. We're going to have to sum a couple of things. You'll see that in a slide here in a moment or two. But just focus on the alpha sub I. There's that regulatory marginal coefficient, and we're going to multiply that by the business indicator. And so we're going to have a few of those, maybe 3, and so we'll have to sum those. That's why I have that big old summation sign out on outside of the parentheses. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this business indicator component, which, I kind of glossed over in that last chapter, but let's go ahead and talk about it more specifically. 3 components, and these are calculated as the average over the most recent 3-year period. So we start out with this ILDC. So this is interests and leases and dividend components. So this consists of variables like interest income and interest expense and dividend income, right? That makes perfect sense. Then we have the service component, which is other operating income and other operating expenses. And this would include fee income as well, plus any fee expenses. And then the final component is the financial component, and this is the average of the last 3 years of stuff that's going on in the trading book and over in the banking book, the profit and losses there. So if you look at those 3 components, what are we trying to do here? A business indicator. We're trying to indicate how well we're doing in the business. And so we're really just kind of summarizing the financial statements. So go ahead and look at the second block point. Consists of select items from a bank's financial statements that are representative of the bank's operational risk exposure. Now let's go ahead and talk about these buckets. The buckets are defined based on size. All right, so look down on the left-hand column there. If we have a business indicator of equal to or less than $1 billion, we throw that into bucket 1. If it's between 1 and 30 billion, then we throw that into bucket 2. And if it's in excess of 30 billion, then we go ahead and throw that into bucket 3. Look on the far right column, there are the coefficients, those marginal coefficients that are given to us by the regulators, 12, 15, and 18. Those are probably fairly easy to memorize. So let's go ahead and take just a quick example here, and you'll see about the summation over there on the far right. Here we have, let's suppose we have a bank holding company with a business indicator of 40 billion. So I want to make a point here before we go on. That will probably be given to you in the problem, although you can never promise what would be given and what wouldn't be given. And so look here, those bottom 3 circle points: interest, fee income, fee expenses, trading book profits and losses. It'd be pretty unlikely for a test creator to give you all that stuff in a big old question stem, although it's possible. So you may have to sum all that stuff. But let's just suppose that we're given this $40 billion worth of a business indicator. So let's figure out how we're going to do this with the summation. So let's go over there. All we're going to do is take the first 1 billion out of that 40 billion. That's relevant for the 12% marginal coefficient. So 12% times 1 gives us the 0.12. Everybody get that on that right-hand column? I don't even know what color that is. A little super light orange, and then in medium light orange. So what are we going to do? We're going to go from 1 to 30 in our second bucket. So that's 29 of the billion. Multiply that by 15%, we get the 435. What's that? Relatively light orange, and then we go down to the regular orange. So we're going to take 40 minus 30, right? So we did the first 30, we did 1, then we did 29. So we're up to 30, then we have to do the final 10. So that's why I have 40 minus 30 over there, times the 18%. That gets us 1.8. So you sum those, and you get 6.27 billion euros for the business indicator component. Now, pause for that with that calculation here for just a second. Let me go ahead and explain this internal loss multiplier. Look at that definition that we have up there at the top. A risk-sensitive component capturing the bank's internal operational losses. Oh, this sounds perfect, right? So it's a sensitivity issue, and that's why I related it back to beta as our measure of systematic risk, back when we were talking about equity portfolios. And there's the equation that's taken right out of the chapter, and this is, especially for those of you who are mathematically inclined, which is, I'm guessing most of you, is that's a relatively simple calculation. And so what I have done is I have gone ahead and decided, let's go ahead and make this calculation. And so this adds value to what is presented in the chapter. So we're going to have these big old parentheses down there. So the exponent of 1 minus 1. And I'll talk about that to you in just a second. And so over on the right-hand side of the plus sign, inside of that ratio, we have the loss component, LC in the numerator. And so what that is, that corresponds to the bank's average historical losses over the preceding 10-year period. So one of the things that we're relying on in computing not only the BIC, but also this internal loss multiplier is a nice record of our activities, right? We need to make certain over the last 10 years that we perform our due diligence, right? Hard work, so that we have this record. And we're going to take that, we're going to take those average historical losses and multiply it by 15. All right, so notice I threw a number in there, 7.17. Those of you who are taking notes or however you're doing this, go ahead and circle that 7.17 and say, hey, Jim just made that number up. And once again, I think that number will probably be given to you on the exam. So that's a creation out of my brain here today. And so all we're going to do is take 7.17 over 6.27. That's going to be our ratio. Now, before I get into the mathematics there, let me go into the next slide, and I'm going to relate that ratio to you, and back to what I was talking about with beta here. So if we have this internal loss less than 1, that's going to be lower operational risk capital required. If it exceeds 1, it's going to be higher operational risk capital required. And then on the odd chance that it equals 1, then we're going to have operational risk capital that's going to be equal to the BIC. So let's go back and do our math here. So those of you who want to get out your calculators, if you do the exponent to 1, what do you get? I don't know, 1 point something 8. Subtract 1. For the exponent of 1, you get about 2.8. Then subtract 1, you get about 1.8. And then you're going to add that fraction over there. Take the natural log. That looks a little bit like the beta of an equity portfolio. So what we're going to do, let me skip over that one there. In this slide, we've put the operational risk definition at the top because I want you to memorize that thing. So you have that there again. Look at that first block equation, operational risk capital, business indicator component times the internal loss multiplier. So this goes back to that formula and equation I had earlier on in the slide deck. So really, all we're going to do is take that 6.27, right? Where do we get that? Let me go back here quickly. So this was the sum of those buckets times the marginal coefficient that's provided to us by the regulators. And then we're going to just weight it by, here, hold on a second, let me go back here. Just to make sure you guys get this. Look at the top block point. We're going to weight it by a risk-sensitive component. And so this is why the green and the orange and the whatever color that is at the bottom, that's why this is so important, and that's why I relate it to beta. And so we have more. Here, let me go back here. What does this one say down in the bottom? Higher operational risk capital required than the 6.27. So we're up to 6.5 operational risk capital. And this is why I was so excited to share this with you, because that final calculation is not specifically presented in the chapter, but now you can make that calculation. How about the second learning objective, in which we're asked to make a comparison of this standardized approach, which we've been talking about, versus an advanced measurement approach, which is one of those internal models. So let me go ahead and read those block points going down. The advanced measurement approach was an approach that banks were allowed to use based on their internal models, right? So look at what we have in bolded there, a diverse range of internal modeling practices. And so the Basel Committee thought that, over time, let's think about, we've got all of these let's just think of the big five bank holding companies, that these big five, and plus all the other medium-sized ones, would eventually move to a best practice, and that there would be an agreement between and among all of those best practices so that we would arrive at some kind of, maybe not a standardized approach, but an approach that would allow regulators and investors and other stakeholders, in addition to financial risk managers, to make a comparison between and among financial institutions. Because remember that one slide that I had, I think it was 2 or 3 chapters ago, there was in bolded, we had, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prevent another taxpayer-funded bailout of large bank holding companies. So really what that means is that we're trying to have a general sense of commonalities in information and data and an approach to operational risk management. So look at the second to last block point. So the standardized measures approach was brought in to solve this problem by reducing the flexibility. So we have these very precise guidelines. And absolutely, that's what we just did back in that mathematical example. Now, how about the last of the 3 learning objectives? What was that first part? General criteria and then specific criteria. And I did mention to you guys that, this is pretty straightforward stuff. So in order to compute that loss component, what did I say earlier? Quality loss data. When I learned this back in graduate school, boy, this was like 1988 or 1990s, 1988 or 1990. We talked about and looked at lots and lots of journal articles on the quality of earnings. And this was a study on, if you can go ahead and put together financial statements, but they have to be accurate and they have to be relevant. And so the same applies here. High quality loss data over the 10-year period, documented procedures, map the internal loss data to the relative supervisory categories. So we've talked about that before. Any loss event of 20,000 euros or more is considered to be material, right? You don't want to keep track of a 9 euro loss, right? Keep records of specific dates. Exclude from the loss data any operational loss events related to credit risk, right? Forget about those things. Market risks as operational risk. Independent data validation mechanism. So here we go. This is great stuff. I love this. We do all of our work together, and then all we do is say, okay, you over there, you're smart. Come on over and make sure that I've done this properly. How about some specific criteria here? All right, so policies that address various aspects of internal loss data. So what does this sound like? This sounds an awful lot like, we've got these business lines, right? And we've got the umbrella. So we have the chief risk officer up here. Sounds an awful lot like we're going to rely on the executive leadership team and perhaps the board of directors to develop these policies that help us, right? So it's not just those of us down at the bottom of each silo. It's got to come from the top. And there's a list of some specific criteria that the chapter discusses, and you should probably be able to self-evaluate those things: direct charges, external expenses, etc., etc. Items excluded from gross loss calculations, so general maintenance, internal or external business enhancement costs, and insurance premiums. And I think that takes us through this slide deck. And so once again, I'm going to offer my sense of accomplishment by completing that learning objective that has the action word, calculate the operational risk. And then when you work through those calculations, then the second learning objective, that one makes perfect sense. So that kind of answers itself. And then you can couple that with general and specific criteria that we just talked about over the past few moments.